It's my great pleasure to introduce you, to welcome you here tonight. My name's Andrea Coomber. I'm the Chief Executive of the Howard League for Penal Reform. Welcome to this Parmoor annual lecture, named in honour of Milo Cripps, Lord Parmoor, who was a great supporter of the Howard League before his passing, an antiquarian book dealer, a raconteur, a huge supporter of reform in the criminal justice space. And we remain hugely grateful to him for his generous support to us in life and beyond it as a charity. And each year we have this lecture in honour of him. Tonight's lecture has been given by somebody quite special. I'll tell you why he's special. He's special to the Howard League. He's special in lots of ways. I'm sure he's special to other people. But for the Howard League, he's special to us because tonight was the first time in 6 years, this afternoon was the first time in 6 years we have had a board meeting without him in the chair. Fergus McNeill has been the chair of the Howard League's board for the last 6 years. He was previously a member of our research advisory group. He proudly has been a member of the Howard League since the 1990s. And he is one, as you would know, of this country's leading criminologists and thinkers about desistance and crime. A hugely well-regarded academic, but I think also a really quite importantly, an enormously humane person who speaks in sort of poems, as I'm sure he will do at some stage at least tonight, and speaks, I think, about a kind of criminal justice system and penal system that we all would wish to be the one that is the case in this country. And I'm afraid at the moment we are some way away from that. So Fergus will speak, I should have said, he's a professor of criminology and social work at the University of Glasgow, and he's got loads of awards, and I'm not going to read out his CV because it would take too long. But I think we're in for a real treat to have a vision of how the criminal justice system might otherwise be. And obviously as a penal reform community, this kind of thought leadership is critically important. So Fergus will speak for 35 minutes-ish, and then there'll be an opportunity for questions from the audience, and then we'll have a chance to go downstairs for some more hospitality from Mishcon de Reya. So please welcome our speaker, Fergus McNeill.
Thank you very much. Thank you. It's lovely to be here and quite special to be invited to give this lecture for this organisation, which obviously is very close to my heart. So my topic is rehabilitation and penal reform. I didn't set out to spend most of the last 40 years engaged in one way or another with these questions, with questions of rehabilitation. At the age of 20, which for the record was 38 years ago, armed only with a degree in philosophy and history and no idea what I wanted to do with my life, I was placed in a drug rehab by a volunteer agency. It was meant to be a kind of post-university gap year. This is a picture of me on the first slide, almost 3 years later. So I stayed for 3 years. That's my last day. I've been thrown in the pond, which was the ceremonial ritual for people leaving the rehab. And these are some of the residents that I lived and worked alongside at that time. I certainly wouldn't be here today. I wouldn't have become a social worker or a criminologist. I would never have had the great privilege of chairing the board of the Howard League for 6 years if I hadn't met and learned from and alongside these men and the other people that I met in that time. In an important sense, they set me on this path. They formed what was to become my obsession. Nonetheless, as this lecture is approached, I felt a real degree of trepidation and awkwardness about my choice of topic. Given the current state of our penal system, or maybe I should say your penal system in England and Wales, to speak about rehabilitation feels almost self-indulgent, if not downright irrelevant. The Justice Committee's recent report presents a very bleak assessment indeed of rehabilitation in the prisons of England and Wales today. Here on the slide are some of the lowlights. I won't read you all of these quotes. Conditions in the estate aren't conducive to rehabilitation, overcrowding, arbitrary transfers, a prison estate in disrepair, prisoners locked up, sometimes for 22 or more hours a day, limited access to purposeful activities or any other kind of activity that might support rehabilitation, underfunded and poorly delivered education with low rates of participation, dreadful outcomes for young people, health and well-being services failing to meet the needs of prisoners, mental health support inconsistent. I could go on. And the committee will go on, because we'll hear from them in due course about rehabilitation and resettlement in the community. Given the careless vandalism to which probation services have been subjected in the last decade or two, I'm really not sure we can expect better news in their next report. So in this context, I think it's not surprising that some very distinguished critical commentators, like Pat Carlin, for example, have argued that rehabilitation is now nothing more than an imaginary, a fiction, a fig leaf that fails to cover up the indecency of our current systems and practices. Of course, even if that is a valid critique of the current state of affairs, it leaves open the twin questions I'm going to address tonight. Should rehabilitation be revived? Can it be revived? And I would say that whatever its travails today, rehabilitation remains one of the most important and commonly used terms in the modern history of criminal justice. Even then, both the ideal, the rehabilitative ideal, and the question of whether and how it should be made real in the practices of prison and probation services, those are profoundly and perennially contested questions, contested in theory, contested in policy, contested in practice, and in the public sphere. To assess where rehabilitation might fit in this project of penal reform, therefore, is not straightforward, since scholars from different disciplines, criminology, history, law, philosophy, psychology, sociology, social policy, social work, to name but a few, they conceive and discuss rehabilitation in different ways, and so they arrive at different conclusions about its merits and demerits. To get a grip on these questions, I aim in this lecture to synthesize some of these diverse perspectives. So I'll begin by discussing how rehabilitation has been defined and debated in penal theory, drawing also on penal history. Then I'll turn to how rehabilitation relates to key policy challenges and international standards. Third, I'll offer a very brief account of contemporary models of rehabilitation, of the sort advocated by psychologists and criminologists. But note that in all three of those parts of the talk, I'll be talking about ideals, not realities. So in the fourth part of the talk, I'll summarize emerging sociology of rehabilitation, studies that describe and analyze how it is constructed in practice and how it's experienced by those at the sharp end. Drawing those strands together, I'll move towards what must be for now a provisional conclusion, also explaining the need for better comparative work on rehabilitation. So, did you get my visual joke, by the way? Good. Okay, as long as you got it. I spent at least 5 minutes on the internet finding a big leaf picture I could use. So rehabilitation as a penal ideal. Philosophers of punishment, legal theorists discuss and debate rehabilitation as one of the most important normative justifications of punishment, one that still, despite everything, commands considerable public support. Nonetheless, rehabilitation, at least in criminal justice context, is not easy to define. Rayner and Robinson, two colleagues and friends of mine, in their book on the subject, noted that even in academic texts, two quite different objectives are often conflated and confused. The first concerns reducing offending or reoffending by somehow changing the disposition, the character, the habit, the thoughts, the attitudes, the values, the behaviours of the person who has offended. And the second concerns securing reintegration into society by somehow changing the social status and position, not disposition, the position of the person who has been punished. And those two things are linked, obviously, but they entail quite different relationships between punishment and rehabilitation. In the dispositional idea, Rehabilitation shapes the nature of punishment. It's how we do it. In the second idea about social positions, rehabilitation comes after punishment. Connecting rehabilitation with post-punishment reintegration is a long-standing continental European tradition. Indeed, the earliest use of the term rehabilitation, according again to Rayner and Robinson, was in the late 17th century in France, where it referred to the undoing of a criminal conviction, the deletion or the expunging of the criminal record. A century or so later, the great Italian penal thinker Beccaria, whose name I can never pronounce at first attempt, reflected a similar meaning of the term in arguing for approaches to punishment focused on re-qualifying individuals as juridical or legal subjects. Thus, rehabilitation in Europe was first seen both as the proper goal of punishment and as an important means by which it might be brought to an end, as even retributive notions of justice require. So there's an interesting idea. Retributive theory requires rehabilitation, I would argue. While these ideas are still very important in European law and practice, in the English-speaking world, rehabilitation is much more commonly associated with notions of individual treatment or correction. Having developed rapidly in the 20th century, along with the social sciences, the psi disciplines, social work, this version of the rehabilitative ideal suffered a crisis famously in the 1970s and 80s. Tony Bottoms, one of this country's greatest penal thinkers, summed up the critique of rehabilitation in 1980 in this way. He said, rehabilitation misconstrues the causes of crime as individual when they were coming to be understood as social and structural. It also failed to recognize how crime itself is socially constructed via criminalization, which is a social process as much as a legal one. At the same time, rehabilitative practices had begun to be exposed as being systematically discriminatory, targeting coercive interventions on the most poor and disadvantaged people in society. Rehabilitation's interference with personal autonomy was increasingly seen as being inconsistent with respect for individual liberties and human rights, particularly in its supposed attempts to psychologically and legally coerce change, as was vividly depicted in Anthony Burgess's famous book and later Stanley Kubrick's very controversial film, A Clockwork Orange. Finally, and critically, the empirical evidence at that time, in the late 70s, suggested that despite its scientific pretensions, rehabilitation just didn't work. Now, powerful though that critique was, and I should make clear, Tony Bottoms was summarizing the critique, not advancing it as his own view. Powerful though it was, it had its limitations. Crucially, from the 80s onwards, evidence about interventions that might have worked or did work played a crucial role in challenging pessimism about rehabilitation's effectiveness. Around the same time, a brief but important flurry of writing about new normative or philosophical approaches to rehabilitation sought to address other criticisms. The new rehabilitationists, great band name, as they were called, or as they called themselves, proposed 4 principles to guide rights-based rehabilitation's excellent principles for the Howard League. First of all, they asserted the duty of the state to provide for rehabilitation, the establishment of proportional limits on the intrusions that rehabilitation imposes, making every effort to maximize choice and voluntarism in the process of rehabilitation, and committing to the use of prison as a last resort, because prison is inherently dehabilitative. Rethinking rehabilitation within the framework of his theory of communicative punishment, the philosopher Anthony Duff advanced the idea of rehabilitation not as correctional treatment, but as a means of repairing relational breaches between the person who had offended, the victim, and the community. And more recently, Ansha Dubois-Pedin, who's a Cambridge-based legal scholar, argues that reintegration is nothing less than punishment's core social function. She says, punishment does not merely mark out the punishee or the offender's actions as wrong and blame him for engaging in the wrongful act. It also defines how both the punished person and the punisher will move forward from there. There is reintegrative momentum inherent in punishment, she says. Now, whatever your preferred approach to punishment, whatever theory you espouse, the importance of generating reintegrative momentum can't be denied. Unless you intend to kill, disable, exile, or permanently imprison people who have offended, you must be concerned with the question of their social reintegration, both as a matter of justice in bringing punishment to an end, and as a matter of crime reduction. So one important and relatively novel way to conceptualize rehabilitation then is to see it as referring to processes and practices that generate reintegrative momentum. Okay, let's take it to policy and international standards now. A few years ago, I was asked to review the evidence about how criminal justice systems might better reduce reoffending. This was for an address to the United Nations most recent Congress on Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice in 2021. And I successfully persuaded my hosts that I couldn't answer the first question without addressing a second question: how do we enable reintegration? I think if you try to decouple the reduction of reoffending from enabling reintegration, you've already lost. Reoffending is a big issue. It's a pressing issue for governments and societies around the world. To go back to the Justice Committee's report, 80% of all offending in England and Wales is reoffending. 80%. And the costs are huge. One estimate from 10 years ago put the financial costs of reoffending by people who'd already been subject to sanctions in the criminal justice system at £15.6 billion per annum. And the cost of those high rates of reoffending are not only fiscal or economic. Behind the statistics, there are citizens, families, groups, businesses suffering crime victimization. And very often, it's those who are already disadvantaged in a variety of other ways that suffer repeated victimization. And since the protection of citizens, and especially the vulnerable, is a key duty of the state, that failure to protect is a political problem. It strikes at the legitimacy of the state itself. If a punished person goes on to reoffend, then their punishment has failed in an important sense. And this presents a problem for all of us, whether we are the offender, the victim, the community, or the state. And yet, here's the paradox in my diagram. The paradoxical reaction to the failure of punishment is to punish more. More of the same. More punishment, more control, more restriction, regenerating the inequalities that often drive the crime in the first place. Now, international bodies like the UN and the Council of Europe have long recognized that trap, the punitive trap, as I sometimes call it, carries its own costs and risks. Not only is it fiscally expensive, it comes into conflict with international standards around human rights. It tends to worsen the disintegration and social disadvantage that drive offending and criminalization. Punitive responses tend to reduce the prospects of both positive personal change and social integration, fueling that cycle. Social stability and solidarity suffer, and so do the prospects for collective flourishing, which are reflected in the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, especially the 16th one. So in this sense, reintegration is a challenge for sustainability, and getting reintegration right is absolutely key to criminal justice's contribution to that wider goal. Both the UN's Mandela rules and the Tokyo rules reflect that aspiration to move away from merely punitive and towards rehabilitative and reintegrative approaches, both in prisons and in the community. So how are we to do it? Well, some researchers, often working at the interface between forensic psychology and criminology, argue that the way out of the trap is to get better at rehabilitation. And according to one very recent review of 53 meta-analyses, so that's a review of reviews, certain kinds of rehabilitative interventions, both in prisons and in community settings, can and do support reductions in reconviction rates. The community-based ones perform better, incidentally, than the prison-based ones. Question of how is complicated. I haven't got time to go into it. There's been a lot of debate about the relative merits of two models. If you know this jargon, you can sing along: the risk-need responsivity model and the good lives model. Much of it much of that debate preoccupied with evidencing the effectiveness of offending behaviour programmes that the models promote. But more recently, another strand of research has stressed the critical importance of the skills of the staff required to enable the development of constructive relationships with the people they're trying to help, modelling pro-social behaviour, and acting as brokers for the other services that people under supervision or in prison or after prison will need. It turns out, surprise, surprise, that people supervised and supported by highly skilled staff have lower reconviction rates than people supervised by less skilled staff. That focus on skills helps broaden our thinking both about the mechanisms and the processes of rehabilitation. It moves us from programmes to practitioners, and to a certain extent it widens the aspiration, whereas the risk-need responsivity model does not ultimately aim at reintegration. It's centrally and solely focused on reducing reconviction, and it draws solely on a scientific base rooted in that metric. Other models like the GLM and the skills-based approaches broaden out and do include work around social integration. Criminology's contribution, more specifically, and with it my own, has been to develop and apply another kind of evidence base about how and why almost all people, even the most persistent in their offending, stop. Drawing on empirical research using a wide range of methods, desistance theories, in the jargon, seek to describe and explain this process of change in and of itself. Desistance from crime can and often does occur without any rehabilitative intervention. People stop, they grow up. Nonetheless, better understanding the process can help us design better rehabilitative supports and services. And that's why so much of my work over the last 25 years has focused on using desistance research to reform and challenge penal practices. Most recently, by connecting conceptual and empirical work on desistance and reintegration, I've argued that securing desistance typically requires that people find acceptance and belonging, but that there are myriad obstacles in their way. So over the last 15 years, I've tried to draw all these interdisciplinary strands together, paying attention to both normative and empirical work in order to develop a clearer and a more comprehensive model of rehabilitation, one that helps to elaborate the range of ways in which reintegrative momentum might be generated, and thereby to suggest how rehabilitation should be imagined and pursued within penal systems. First of all, shading isn't terribly effective here, but I think it's kind of purple. First of all, in purple, there was a 4 forms of rehabilitation model, and it became quite influential in scholarly and professional debates. Within that model, personal rehabilitation refers to any activity that focuses on enabling changes within the individual to support desistance from offending. That might include, for example, not just offending behaviour programmes, but vocational training, education, health-related interventions, engagement with the arts or with sports, anything that helps the person develop themselves. Judicial or legal rehabilitation concerns when, how, and to what extent a person's full citizenship rights are formally restored. That being a key step in enabling social participation, including within the labour market. Moral and political rehabilitation concerns the remediation of the person's civic relationships with the victim of their offence and with their wider community. Importantly, it also relates to the reintegration-related duties of the state and the polity and of civil society. If people are being punished on our behalf, we all have a responsibility to bring their punishment to an end. So everybody ought to be invested in reintegration. That's a moral duty, I would argue. And finally, even where personal development's been achieved, where legal requalifications confirmed, where moral obligations around redress and reparation have been settled, the question of social rehabilitation remains. And this relates to that question of social acceptance and belonging. And that depends on not the person returning, but the people to whom they return in their communities. Now, these 4 forms are interdependent. So criminal justice systems, I argue, need to attend to all of them. I've argued that the goal of rehabilitation needs to be not just reducing reoffending, but rather enabling reintegration both as a matter of justice and human rights and as a means of crime reduction. And a few people have started to use this model in various ways to address policy debates and also to do some comparative work. But annoyingly, not that recently, a few years ago, a PhD researcher under my supervision, Alejandro Rubio Arnal, noted some flaws in my model and improved it by adding 2 further dimensions. How it was possible for me not to have seen the importance of material rehabilitation, I do not know. But that refers simply to having the means to subsist within a society, a place to live, a secure place to live, and a basic income. Without those things, nobody can be integrated. So Alejandro was certainly right to point out the importance of that. And secondly, he split moral rehabilitation from civic political rehabilitation, which is useful partly in drawing particular attention to the political life of people caught up in the criminal justice system and the questions of disenfranchisement and reenfranchisement, which I think are an important part of this argument. So nowadays, we both agree the 6 forms model is better, and that's the one that we are seeking to use. Okay, so much for all the ideals. It's time for reality to bite. And this isn't from the House of Commons Justice Committee's reports. This is from sociological research across many parts of the world. A more philosophically informed and an evidence-based understanding of what rehabilitation should be doesn't tell us about practice, realities, and it doesn't tell us about lived experience. And if we set aside the parliamentary committees and the work of inspectorates, then we will find an at least equally concerning picture in sociological and ethnographic studies of what rehabilitation feels like and is like today. To set the scene, first of all, sociologists of punishment, people that try to understand how the institutions of punishment change over time, argue that the decline of post-war collectivism and welfarism and the preoccupation with risk that emerged in late modern societies meant that rehabilitation's traditional justification as a means of reclaiming or helping disadvantaged people, that lost its cultural purchase, it lost its grip. According to Glenn Robinson, another good colleague and friend, to survive these changes, rehabilitation had to transform and remarket itself to appeal to 3 late modern penal narratives. She labels them utilitarian, managerial, and expressive. So as well as protecting the public, rather than rescuing the offender, rehabilitation promised to deliver an efficient return on public investment. That's the managerial. It promised to express condemnation and censure as part of its project of correction. That was the expressive, even punitive perhaps. And crucially, there was a shift from seeing the offender as a human subject in rehabilitation to constructing them as rehabilitation's object. Rehabilitation worked on them for us, if that distinction means anything. And that takes us back to Anthony Burgess, incidentally, and The Clockwork Orange. However, as Goodman, Page and Felch, in one of my favourite books, argued, differently situated actors within criminal justice systems who have different kinds of capital and different resources available to them endlessly contest the nature of criminal justice. To understand penal change then, change in these systems, we have to understand not just the big distal social forces that shape our social institutions, but proximate shifts, things that happen in our specific field, the field of punishment, and we need to go deep into the local everyday realities of the actors who constitute what punishment will mean in practice reality. As I put it in a book a few years ago, to understand contemporary rehabilitation, we need to understand how it is contested all the way down to the front lines. Not just in the ivory tower, the corridors of power, the crucibles of public debate, but in the halls, the treatment rooms, the classrooms, the workshops, and the front and back offices of probation services, and the NGOs and third sector organisations, in the businesses that exclude or accept people with criminal convictions, in the communities that welcome or expel those that try to return. Equally, seeking to understand how rehabilitation is experienced by those subject to it leads us to the recent revival and expansion of ethnographic approaches to the study of punishment. And most directly pertinent here is a developing body of work about the pains of rehabilitation. This work begins in the mid-20th century with famous studies on the pains of imprisonment, and that framing has now been expanded to look at the pains of probation, the pains of re-entry, in this context, the pains of rehabilitation. So what are these pains? Well, there's growing evidence in our system, in England and Wales, about how prisoners suffer the soft power of prison psychologists and others involved in key decisions about rehabilitation and reintegration. Soft power is a concept deployed by Ben Crew at the Institute of Criminology in Cambridge. But beyond his work, a range of studies across different countries have exposed ways in which both people in prison and people on probation or parole feel the pressure to contort their perceptions and presentations of self in line with the requirements of the rehabilitative programs or processes to which they are subject. They're compelled to shape themselves to suit the narrative. And as Jason Warr has argued in some really important recent work based on research in an English prison, that's also a racialized process. For young black men, if they want to progress within the prison to release and they want to be successful in post-release supervision, they have to act less black. That's Jason's conclusion. In recent work on supervision in the community and on post-prison reintegration, I've worked with others within and beyond the academy to develop and employ new creative methodologies to help better understand and represent these kinds of experiences. And using those methods powerfully exposes ways in which rehabilitation services can and do sometimes help people towards desistance and reintegration, but also often leave people feeling significantly constrained, misjudged, misrecognized, treated like waste, or to use their words, shit, and or left in limbo. In a recent paper, I went as far as I've gone, exploring the question of whether and when rehabilitation itself becomes a form of state violence, structural, symbolic, systemic violence, and conversely, when it enables violence reduction, both meaning enabling positive change in the person undergoing rehabilitation, but also reducing the violence of the state in the penal system. My conclusion was that to function as a legitimate and effective kind of violence reduction, rehabilitative systems, technologies, and practices must work through moral recognition of and respectful dialogue with their subject. Now, yeah, there is another slide. Oh, God. Yes. This, of course, begs the crucial question. And we're getting to the end now. There's about 3 pages to go. Bear with me, the drinks are not too far away. It begs the crucial question, is rehabilitation doing any good anywhere or any other time? And that is the question that, as a lifelong advocate and supporter of rehabilitation, I am now forced to confront. And it's what led me to imagine and design a comparative study of rehabilitation and reintegration in Europe, which I'll speak briefly about in a moment. Why do comparative work on this question? Well, despite many conceptual and methodological challenges, the case for comparative study of punishment is crystal clear to me. As Niels Christie argued, penal systems carry deep meanings. They convey information on central features of the states they represent. They tell us who we are. These systems tell us who we are. He also recognized the need to look at the full range of penal practices in order to assess the character of the state. It's not just about the size of the prison population or the state of prison conditions. My own book, Pervasive Punishment, on forms of supervision and their proliferation and pervasiveness, underlined the importance of examining not just the most severe or repressive parts of the system, but also practices too commonly assumed to be more progressive or benign. Sometimes states do a great deal of harm when they think they're doing good, not least by expanding the scale, reach, and intensity of penal control in the name of rehabilitation and reintegration. That's why it seemed to me that a comparative study of rehabilitation in 3 progressive states was so necessary. Within wider debates about Nordic exceptionalism, Norway is often cast both as a less punitive social democracy and as an archetype of a generous welfare state, sometimes referred to by Norwegians as Big Mother. And I think the kind of slightly scary connotation of that is definitely intended. It's renowned both for its low imprisonment rate and for its commitment to the principle of normality, making life inside prisons as much like normal life outside as possible, and also for its import model, bringing public services into prisons. Norway's correctional services have also been seen as leaders in both social scientific and technological innovation in prisons and probation. However, scholars have also argued that there might be a dark side to Nordic welfareism. When ambitious state projects are combined with a culture of intervention, the result may be paternalism. Big Mother's embrace might feel warm and benign, but also oppressive, stifling, and illiberal. Recent analyses suggest that Norway's criminal justice system combines a hands-off, laissez-faire approach in some cases with a strong interventionist rehabilitation approach in others. So, as with everywhere else, the picture is complicated. Turning to the Netherlands, it's often been celebrated as an exceptionally tolerant, liberal, and progressive society, one that laid claim to the oldest probation services in the world, incidentally, established in 1823, services which are still sometimes described as being at the cutting edge of evidence-based rehabilitation and of the development, again, of new technologies. Even there, though, contemporary political rhetoric and legal change have focused on law and order. Criminal justice organizations are still oriented towards rehabilitation, but there too, according to local researchers, rehabilitation has taken on a more instrumental character, framed as a way to secure society and reduce recidivism rates. Turning to my own beloved country, Scotland, the supposed distinctiveness of Scotland is said to rest in its enduring commitment to rehabilitation and to a more welfarist and solidaristic approach to people who have offended. It's also been at the forefront of international developments around the new approaches to rehabilitation informed by desistance research that I've discussed already. But unlike the Netherlands and Norway, Scotland has one of the largest correctional populations in Western Europe, both in prisons and in the community. Recent research has suggested that an enduring policy commitment, and by enduring I'm talking a century of policy commitments to reducing the prison population and to advancing rehabilitation, those commitments have tended to conceal rather than diminish both the pains of imprisonment and those of supervision. And working with colleagues at the University of Edinburgh, I've argued recently that reviewing our approach to prisoner disenfranchisement, there are some important contradictions within Scotland's supposed commitment to rehabilitation and reintegration. Welfareism, it seems, has its limits. Now, in my career so far, I've been very fortunate to have had opportunities to engage with people who share my interests, but who see them from quite different positions and places. I mean that geographically, ideologically, politically, philosophically. So I've had good reason to reflect on what can be learned, both from hosting visitors who ask difficult questions and from being the one asking the tricky questions of trusted local guides. In these contexts, I sometimes quote Robert Burns, who clearly understood what the troubles and travails of comparative dialogue had to offer. Now I'm going to speak it in Scots, but you can read it in English. Oh, what some power the giftie gie is to see herself as others see us. It would free many a blunder free us and foolish notion. What airs and dress and gait would lead us, and even devotion. In other words, if we could see ourselves the way that we're seen by others, particularly by strangers, what notions would we be disabused of if we engaged seriously in that dialogue. This mirrors the famous sociologist Zygmunt Bauman's view of the twin roles of sociologists as defamiliarizing the familiar and familiarizing the unfamiliar, basically breaking apart the taken for granted. So in this vein, in the project I'm about to begin with colleagues and friends in Leiden and Oslo, we're going to develop a new approach and method to comparative penology. We're calling it pompously dialogical comparative penology. What does that mean? Well, embarrassingly, in simpler language, it means allowing people who participate in our project in each country to talk to each other internationally, so that they become part of the inter-country comparisons. And we think that by doing that, we can help to make the penal ideals, customs, habits, and practices that we take for granted strange as we show them to others, and as we see them through those unfamiliar eyes. And I think that can help to puncture complacency about how progressive, fair, or evidence-based our approaches might be. This is the kind of humbling that matters when we think we're doing good and when we think we're doing comparatively well. Since the 6 forms model of rehabilitation was developed both through comparative work and through Alejandro's pioneering dialogical study of reintegration in Glasgow, I hope that the project will fully exploit the potential of this as an analytical framework. So as you can see, the 6 forms inform our analysis of ideals in the first work package, but also a quantitative exploration of the scale and shape of rehabilitation, what is actually happening in each country, in prisons and in communities. We're going to examine the technologies that are used to do rehabilitation, not just new technologies, but also old technologies. And then crucially, in work package 4, we're going to focus on practice experiences and lived realities of rehabilitation in the 3 countries. So that's the design. I'm going to end by returning, at last, you may say, to the question of rehabilitation and penal reform. To do so, I want to share a very early conversation about the idea of developing this project with one of my now co-investigators, Miranda Bona, in Leiden. When I first pitched to her a project on rehabilitation, she expressed reservations. She didn't, and she still doesn't, like the way that the term rehabilitation might seem to imply that there's a definable group of people who stand in need of some kind of special correctional treatment. Like me, and like most criminologists, Miranda doesn't believe that criminals exist as a real subcategory of persons. They're just people who we've chosen to criminalize. There's therefore nothing distinctive or different about them that needs correction, she argued. So in my efforts to talk her around, I made just 2 points. Firstly, I made very clear to Miranda, as I hope I have to you, that I'm not interested in promoting a vision or a version of rehabilitation as correction. I think rehabilitation is much more complex and much more multifaceted than that. I agree with her that since crime is a social construct and since criminalization is a social process, one full of bias, by the way, the idea that criminalized people are fundamentally different from other people, or worse still, that they are personally deficient in some way, is at best muddle-headed and at worst downright offensive. My second point might at first sound like a complete contradiction, but I don't think it is. It's just this. Don't we all need rehabilitation? And sometimes maybe even correction? What I mean here is that we all do harm to other people and therefore to social relationships that matter. After all, we all depend on our relationships to survive and thrive as humans. If we care about people we've harmed and about repairing our relationships with them, then surely at some time we're all going to need something like rehabilitation, and perhaps sometimes something not unlike correction. Even at this age, I still want to change. I still want to develop. I still want to be a better person, both for the people that I love and also for myself. So while I share the concern of critical criminologists and of abolitionists that rehabilitation can be misused, both to legitimate failing and unjust systems and institutions and to cause and conceal real harm, I just don't think I can do without it. And in terms of the future of criminal justice, I don't think I can imagine a constructive way of responding to harm, wrong, conflict that doesn't involve something like rehabilitation as a series of interconnected ways of enabling reintegration. Now, we may seem a long way from fulfilling that kind of vision right now, but that can't be a reason to give up hope. And it's why your support for the Howard League matters so much to me, to the board, and to the staff. Don't give up. Everyone can change. Even the populist, even the punitive, deserve their shot at redemption. Thank you very much.
Jonathan, how learned it. And Fergus, brilliant, thank you. I've learned a lot. You've given us an awful lot about the what, the why, and great chunks about the how. I'm really looking forward to seeing how your project gets going. There's another one which I won't go into, but can I ask you a really difficult question? It always has been for me anyway. An old boss of mine used to say to me, Jonathan, great presentation. What do we do on Monday?
Okay. Well, what I'll be doing on Monday is that, and for the next 5 years. And actually, I'm not being flippant. I think one of the practical tools that we hope to develop through this project is a kind of, it's almost a version of, of this model turned into something that allows organizations like the Howard League or ministries of justice or probation services or individual prisons or third sector organizations to self-assess, to say, if this is a comprehensive model of rehabilitation which is informed by all sorts of research, how do we elaborate it, explain it, develop it in such a way that it allows practitioners, campaigners, advocates, people living the thing, policymakers, politicians, to at least ask the question, what would we have to do if we were serious about this? And I hope, I think I can already give you a kind of version of that as a sort of guide to interrogating your practice, interrogating the design of your system. And I quite often, when I'm invited to speak overseas, I use the excuse of my lack of local knowledge to get them to do a self-assessment of this nature. I say, well, here's the model. Could you just, before I come, maybe just put together a couple of pages for me telling me what you do under each of these headings and what you think of as being the most important parts of rehabilitation in your country? And the answers are very revealing. There are some places where they lop off civic political completely, won't even go there. There are places that are pretty strong on the restorative justice version of the moral. And there are loads of places that think they're doing the personal development side of rehabilitation to a degree. But when you probe for evidence about how many people in the system are really getting significant developmental opportunities, the claims start to fall apart. So one practical outcome of the project will be, we hope, a really well articulated tool that allows people who are serious about this to examine the comprehensiveness of what they're doing, and that will allow them to assess strengths and weaknesses, I think. There are lots of other ways to answer your question, which are, when you get, as I have been over the last 10 years, super frustrated by failure at the policy level and political cowardice in our field, one approach is to retreat into the micro and to be a human who welcomes people in your community. To be active in that is as an important a contribution as you can make to rehabilitation as anything more grandiose like this. So I think we need more sort of citizen activism and advocacy of the right sorts and with the right caveats as well. So that's a micro answer and a sort of systemic answer, which is more than enough. So.
Sorry, I'm Gloria Morrison from Jengo, Joint Enterprise Not Guilty by Association. And the Howard League are fantastic and have been supporting a lot of the work we've been doing about prisoners being convicted under joint enterprise. We're going to start something next year. It's a bit of a left field question, but I think you can really help us. We want to abolish child lifers in this country. We're the only country in Europe that sends children to prison for life. Scotland have done it, haven't they? And could you give us, or just send me to the research that I can find out how we can start our work here in this country, because we are probably the most punitive country, let alone rehabilitative country, but punitive, that we send children as young as 13 to prison for life, or 12 if you can get away with it. But how did Scotland do it?
Well, did Scotland do it? So that's actually technically quite a complicated question to answer, but the people you should speak to from a criminological perspective, I would say, are Leslie McCara and Susan McPhee at the University of Edinburgh, who did hugely important research looking at child development into and through not just the criminal justice system, but our children's hearing system, which was supposed to be diversionary and welfarist. And they discovered that even becoming known in that system as somebody who was referred on offence grounds was enough to make it harder for children to leave crime behind. And using that body of evidence, they have been hugely influential in changing practices within the hearing system, and to a certain extent also in the adult criminal justice system. We now have a sentencing guideline which requires judges to consider rehabilitation first up to the age of 25. It's controversial, and I'm not sure to what extent it has been fully implemented. It's a guideline, it's not an instruction. We have finally managed to get everybody under 18 out of youth offender institutions and into secure care settings, but we don't have adequate secure care in Scotland, so it's complicated, and there's exceptional cases that are dealt with in particular ways that are troubling. And you can still in Scotland, although we've raised the age of criminal responsibility from 8 to 12, you can still be convicted and sentenced to be detained at Her Majesty's pleasure at the age of 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18 in Scotland. So although you would go to a secure care facility rather than going into something like a YOI, actually when you reach the relevant age, you would find yourself in a Scottish prison. So we're not, certainly not there, but there has been progress, and Susan and Leslie have been key, at least among the academic community, have been key architects of that progress.
I'm fascinated by your talk because I've been spending the last 15 years making a comparison between the English and the Scottish juvenile justice systems. And Leslie McCara was my examiner. Is she here?
No, you should speak to her. You'll have the answer for her.
No, I won't have the. Well, I mean, the obvious answer is that the minute for those who don't know anything about the hearing system, it's an entirely welfare-based system. It's the exact opposite of what we do in England and Wales. And I was a juvenile court magistrate in England for 25 years and couldn't bear what I was doing. And I happened to go and visit Scotland in '85 and learn what they were doing. And I came back and was telling my colleagues, and they said, "Don't be so stupid. Children will never learn if you don't punish them." And I said, "Well, go and ask the Scots." But what happens is that when the judiciary get their hands on them, they punish them. And that's the problem. In England, we start doing it the minute they walk in the courtroom. And I think one of the clever things that the Labour government did in '97, some dreadful things they did with their ASBOs, but one of the good things they did was, or the act after that, was to take away the power of dealing with first offenders from the magistracy. And that has changed that scene completely there. But it's depressing to hear you say, I know the Scots custody rate's very high, but it's good to hear that they're not locking up so many under 18s anymore.
Yeah, but that's also the case in England and Wales as well. and in many other countries. So I wouldn't claim that as a distinctively Scottish success. I think there was a question at the back here. And then...
Hello, Elaine Player, King's College, London. Thank you very much for a fascinating lecture. My question is, do you think that a right to rehabilitation would make very much difference? Would you favour the introduction of a right, a legal right to rehabilitation?
It's a really good question. And I guess the answer is going to be one of those qualified answers. It depends what it means. Like, so in Scotland, we have had actually the Scottish Conservative Party leader, not the current one, but the preceding one, campaigning for a right to rehabilitation in respect of drug services. And this is, in that context, it's to do with I would argue, a socially and morally conservative position in favour of abstinence-based drug treatment, which it suits the Conservatives to support, rather than a harm reduction approach. Now, I'm not making a political point between the two approaches. I think there's room for both, and I have experience of both in different contexts. But that's a right that would have created a right to access a particular kind of treatment. And what the rehabilitationists were arguing for, the new rehabilitations, was not that. It was the right to receive the support that you need in order to be restored and reintegrated within society. So a bit more like, in my mind anyway, what the Norwegians had for a time and referred to as the Norwegian guarantee, the reintegration guarantee, which was not a legal right, but it was a kind of a policy commitment that created a perceived duty on public authorities to play their part in supporting the reintegration of people after prison. So I'd love it if we had a framework of rights-based reintegration entitlements. Like, nobody should leave prison without secure and safe housing. Nobody should leave prison without their benefits claim already having been progressed and commencing on day one. I could, once I start ranting about what release is actually like, I won't stop. But it's so far removed from the kind of practical measures required in order to enable punishment to end that, I think it's a scandal, frankly, a national scandal, and it's not much better in Scotland than it is in England. So I'm not celebrating something that we're doing well. But yeah, for me, you'd have to think about what the right was in relation to these domains. So for people who want and need some kind of personal development, they should be able to access it. Because you're in prison, there's no reason why your education should be interrupted at any level, from high school to university to PhD. I would have that as a right. I don't think it follows from being in prison that you have to end your education. I haven't got time to go around the circle, but I would want to frame a set of rights that responded to different elements of the model.
Hi, Tessa Webb. I'm recently retired from 44 years of probation in all roles: probation officer, senior manager, inspector. I'm really interested in what you're going to explore really under that civic political rehabilitation, because I feel like I've watched the demise, not just of probation, of the criminal justice system steadily over the last 20 years because of the lack of tolerance and the national political, I think wherever you are in the system, people looking over their shoulder thinking, what will people say? So I'm completely with you. What they need when they come out of prison, they need a roof over their head. But if you're the accommodation provider and you've got others that are not coming out of prison and not criminal, you think, oh, well, the public would prefer that I gave the resource to them. They can go to the bottom of the queue. And as we stand at the moment, our community doesn't support our justice. It disowns it. It thinks it's something they don't want to know about. It happened over there. But the optimist in me is that there's an opportunity at the moment, because it's so bad. Actually, the public, colleagues, friends that have never had an interest in what I've done most of my life are actually quite interested at the moment, because they don't feel very safe, because people aren't being managed well. So isn't that, I feels like that circle will open the door to the others.
Yeah.
And they're all got their hands tied behind their backs until that bit undoes. When I first went in, became a senior, I went to some training at the Home Office, and the strapline was a safe, just and tolerant society. We've lost that last word.
That's so woke. But I think, yeah, I mean, I think that's also a good moment as we draw near to drinks, I'm sure, to stress why the Howard League is so important. Because even in the Scottish context, and certainly much more so in England and Wales, in the UK Parliament, the quality of public and political debate about crime and justice is deplorable. And, you know, we understand that we're living in difficult times where authoritarianism and populism are on the rise. And that has alarming potential consequences for criminal justice policy, as for lots of other areas. As for the future of democracy and the rule of law, we shouldn't be in any way complacent about any of those things in this historical moment. We don't have to look far to see the threats. But the response to those conditions cannot and must not be one of appeasement. You don't deal with populism by caving in to ill-informed demands for, I would call them, criminogenic policies. Policies that make us all less safe and that make our society less capable of collective flourishing. You have to stand up. And if politicians find that their focus groups are pointing them in a different direction, or that their party managers won't allow them to take a more evidence-based approach, then it has to fall to groups like the Howard League to be speaking in the public sphere about evidence, about realities, about the lived experience of their members in prison, about what they learn from also being in an association that draws together many people with other forms of criminal justice experience like you. It's so important. So I would say, you know, the other thing that you could do on Monday is find a friend to become a new member of the Howard League. Talk to one person, see if you can get them to sign up.
Thank you, Fergus. Sorry, is there one more question? No? Who'll be around for drinks? Just to say, we have next Thursday, we have our annual members meeting that's online. If you want to hear what the Howard League is doing about all of these things, then please join us at the box next Thursday. We'll send you details. I want to introduce and invite Thomas Sullivan, who's our interim chair of our board, to make it. Thanks.
Thank you, everyone. The interim and far less poetic, just picking up on where Fergus left off there, given the challenges that we face, given the threats that there are, it's really important that organisations like the Howard League are well supported by all of you, well funded by our generous donors, well led by Andrea and her excellent team, but also well governed so that we're sustainable for the future. And I just want to say it's been a real privilege to succeed briefly. Fergus, who's really cared about the governance of the trust, the humaneness of what we do as a board, its ethics and our sustainability. So thank you for everything that you've shared with us tonight, but thank you for the legacy that you've left to us as trustees. And my second thank you is to our wonderful supporters and hosts here at Mishcon de Reya. It really is, it's a beautiful place to be. It's so generous of you to share that space with us and our supporters. We're really grateful, and we take heart and encouragement from that. So thank you to all the staff partners here at Mishcon de Reya. Round of applause.